Okay, so all technical and logistic issue being solved, we may start. Is it okay with the microphone? Okay. I'm sorry, I'm getting very tired. But nevertheless, tired but very happy that we have this official first book award multi-language ceremony. So before we officially start, I must say I'm personally very happy we made it as an organization, as an executive committee, and more precisely as a group of a small group of people who have been very much involved in this project on a personal level. Excuse me? You may see it this way because it's better to have a side full than some people on their own in this side. Perfect. Thank you. As you can hear, I'm not a native English speaker and not a perfect English speaker. I'm not a fluent person, but I've learned through times to don't care. To consider that it's better for me to speak even with mistakes in English, that to silence myself. But no. I'm kind of beyond that now, so I don't need any encouragement, but some people need. And it was really the spirit of what we've been trying to do, to leave people time, to say it's not, if we want really to be an inclusive and a fair organization, we need to consider that it's not a fair expectation to consider that anyone at the level of the PhD will be able to write a perfect English-speaking thesis. I may be wrong, but it's my conviction. And I shared that with several people in the, in the executive committee. And because we had experienced the same thing, and I must say that those who had not the same experience were really in favor of this project, but some of them were simply afraid of the logistic of it. So we decided that we were going to have a subgroup to work more actively on this project. And so I'm going to name them. So the first person was Jelena Juranovic. So you already met her. She was a member of the executive committee. Catherine Gilbert, again. Myself, and most of all, Magdalena Sarius-Wolska, who is here and to who I will leave the floor in a minute. So all this being said, I think we managed to do it. And we can officially give this first multi-language book award of the MSA to the winners this year. So it's been already publicized, but now we can welcome here in person. So Daniel Palacios Gonzalez for a book entitled De Fosas Comunes a Lugares de Memoria, la práctica monumental como escritura de la historia. So I give you officially your diploma. You're most welcome. And Magda, in a minute, will come back to the very long process and very fair process of this decision. But that's the book, yeah. But you will know more about it in a minute. And but the jury, in its work, also decided that two other books deserved a special mention. So I will officially give a diploma to their authors. So the first one is Thomas van der Poets for a book called Contemporary Auschwitz, an interactional synchronic approach to collective memory. So Thomas is here. And the second honorable mention is Maya Martin Hobbs' Return to Vietnam, an oral history of American and Australian veterans' journeys. Is she here? No. So we will send it to her. So Magda is going to explain the process, but first of all, I'm not going to read the names because you have all the names here. I will maybe especially thank to Alejandro Bayer, who is here because he's going to be as a discutant and presenting the book. But as you see, thanks to, again, the real huge energy Magda put in this process, we managed to build a multi-language skilled jury. And you are the names here of all the people who agreed to, in a way, go on an adventure. Because one of the things is, what we really wanted to do at the beginning with Magda was to say, maybe we will not manage to do it. Maybe we will fail, but it's important to try to do it. And we will see at the end. We hope that we succeeded. Thank you, Magda.
Thank you, Sarah. And also huge thanks to all people who were involved in that. And I will very briefly, really very briefly, because most of that has been already said during our members meeting, but for those of you who weren't there, very briefly go to the procedure so that you know how we've picked up Danielle as the winner. So as Sarah said, we relaunched the first book awards, and any books published in 2021 and any first books published in 2021 and 2022 were accepted. First books in the academia means usually, not always, but quite often, results of the PhD project. We decided that the nomination must come from an MSA member, but self-nominations were also possible. We did it in 2 stages. And indeed, we had to find some kind of a compromise. So in the first stage, we asked the nominees to submit a summary up to 2,500 words in English so that we were able to decide which of the books we would like to read in detail. So it's not that it was fully multilingual. The summaries must be submitted in English, and on that basis, we shortlisted 10 books in any language and then chose the winner. And the 10 shortlisted books were these ones. So we had 8 books in English, 1 in German, and 1 in Spanish, I think, if I see it correctly. And most of the submissions were in English, but there were also 2 in German, 2 in Spanish, and 1 in Italian. So some people submitted also in other languages, and we were happy that it worked out. We had a wonderful jury, which was just, the names were just displayed, of 10 scholars, and they all spoke very different languages. So it was absolutely possible to distribute the 10 books among them, so that each book was read by at least 2 jury members. We decided, or first discussed intensively, and then decided which criteria were the most important for us. And basically the most important criterion was the contribution to memory studies. So if you read books, they have different values. They may have a wonderful structure. Daniel's book has a wonderful structure. They may be perfectly written. Daniel's books is also perfectly written. They may have great research questions, great methodology, and. But we decided for the purpose of this competition, the most important thing is that this book, written in whatever language, has to be a very good and perfect contribution to memory studies, well, work well. Daniel happened to be the winner because his book fulfilled all the criteria we agreed on. Yeah, and maybe we will now talk a little bit more about the book by the winner. So Alejandro was a member of the jury. Alejandro Bayer. Until May, he was at the University of Minnesota, and now he's a visiting fellow at the Universidad Nacional de Educación a Distancia. Sorry for my Spanish pronunciation. Daniel is currently based in Birkbeck College. So we agreed that first Alejandro, who read the book in Spanish, will present its values, and then we will have a short conversation. Luckily enough, there exists also an English manuscript, an English version of the book, non-published, so I could read the English version for the purpose of this conversation, but even if I had not, we would certainly could find someone who did. So, yeah, Alejandro. And maybe you both can move to the front. I will give you the mic.
Well, first of all, congratulations, Daniel. And I also want to thank Magdalena for chairing the committee and for making the process enjoyable for all of us at the jury. So let me start by just saying a few things about the book, since you don't know it. The book deals with the aftermath of the Spanish Civil War, and it has a focus on the monuments and rituals that have emerged around Republican mass graves, those containing the bodies of the defeated in the war, mostly executed civilians, since 1936, so the start of the war, until the present. So Daniel responds to the following questions in his book. How did monuments and memorial practices around them evolve over time from the beginnings in the midst of the Civil War, placing of stones, or well, not during the Civil War, actually later, once the Civil War was over in 1939, but during the dictatorship, placing of stones, flowers, even carving small marks in surrounding trees. To later, during transition to democracy, construction of more stable structures like gardens and sculptures. A second question he answers is, what do these monuments and rituals tell us about the social milieu, the immediate and the larger socio-political context they are embedded in, and that they also sought to influence? And thirdly, how have these practices contributed to the process of creating awareness? And Daniel writes about critical historical and political consciousness, which opens an interesting route of analysis that is very, very generative and thought-provoking. So as Daniel writes, these were different strategies to expand memory beyond the mind. I like this formulation. So this is an externalization of memory, and at the same time, once the memory is externalized, objectified in this way through monument and ritual, the struggle for meaning involving different actors like families and later activists, and in more recent time, governmental agencies. Let me highlight a few things about the book that I found remarkable. First of all, the empirical scope, the documentary scope of the work is also impressive. It covers a sample of more than 100 monuments located across the entire country, and as I said, from 1936 to the present. And the detail, the richness of the cases is fascinating. We have access to oral accounts, to visual documentation. Also, it's important that many of these visuals found their way into the book, so we really get a sense of the process through the material that you have gathered and in the publication. Then what's also important to point out is the attention to formal and social dimensions in what Daniel terms production of monument practices. So formal and social dimensions of the monuments themselves, and the rituals, which is social practice in itself, but how these rituals emerged and changed over time. It is a very important contribution to the field. We just discussed about the methodological, and I want to say a few things about that. but not only methodological, also substantial and theoretical. And in that sense, methodologically, we can underline that this is a longitudinal, multi-method, transdisciplinary approach to the study of monuments and memorial practices. A very rare and productive combination of historical research, phenomenology, ethnography, visual analysis, art history. And it's also, let me also mention what the book entails in terms of a contribution to memory scholarship on Spain. And here I'd like to say that Daniel's work is a sign of a very robust scholarship on Spain, produced by a new generation of scholars that have addressed the multiple dimensions of a complex and continuously contentious process of coming to terms with the legacies of the Franco regime and its crimes. And some of these scholars are here at MSA and here also in the room. So Daniel belongs to a generation of scholars that is produced work that is methodologically very sound, theoretically very insightful, and that also have the capacity to see in a comparative perspective and draw from theories, in your case, from many different fields, but really to incorporate them into the analysis of your case study in a brilliant manner. So, a few more things to end and give you the word. What I would say the main contribution to the debate is that this is the debate on memory in Spain is that the temporal scope allows sort of a critical re-evaluation of the forensic approach that has been the focus of memory activism in Spain. I would say also the focus of most of memory scholarship in the last decade or and a half. And your work allows us to see this in a broader context of memorial management of the sites of violence, and interestingly also the clash of paradigms, right? The forensic turn or the forensic approach, which is individualizing approach, versus the monumental material that has a more collective dimension. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that. So theoretically, Daniel sees these monuments memorial practices as a sign in dispute. This is history of art from below, as you write, or social history of art. And the book tells a story of how this community of defeated created ideal figures, symbols, reference that seek honor. And on that, I would like to leave it there so you can explain us a little bit about this, the theoretical insight you draw on these issues, on this contraposition between honor and dignity. So the structure of the monograph is somewhat unconventional, and makes it interesting, but it's also challenging, and it's taking a risk because the theory somehow emerges throughout after you learn about, in depth about the cases, which is not the norm. Usually the whole theoretical apparatus is at the beginning of the book, then comes your case, and then comes your analysis and your conclusions. Then you also take interesting literary licenses that are also, I would say, not so conventional, and the book has a strong personal voice, which again is courageous, and in my view, from my reading, it's successful and it's honest. So to end, poignant, theoretically sophisticated book, deeply engaged with important questions of our field, and also of current public debates in Spain and beyond. So congratulations again.
Thank you. It's an object of power in this room. So we agreed that we won't have with Daniel a classical questions and answers session, but we want to have a short conversation about how he wrote his book and how he did his research. And I really agree with Alejandro that it's an exemplary work of also theory building and triangulating different methods. So you established a huge digital database. You did ethnographic work, you combined it with art history, and you conducted interviews, observations, you did phenomenological analysis. And we agreed also that in this conversation we won't talk about the particular case studies, but rather on the way Daniel worked, as I said, because that might be also inspiring for other junior and non-junior people working in the field. So I'm just dropping this topic of combining different methods and different approaches and balancing them in a way that in the end you provide us with a theory and concept of monument practices. How did you do that? And maybe we can talk a bit about that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your positive perception of my book. Thank you also to Sara and to Alejandro for their words. And first of all, also thank you to the all MSA organization, the people who is making possible this conference, the people who is here organizing microphones, pictures, and the whole rooms. It's very important to always say thank you very much for all your work. Also, not to forget the people who made possible this research, because somehow I think books are not just a consequence of a great idea that you just sit in a room and you write. It was also necessary not only my own research, but also having the really, really amazing support of a research group that some of the members are there, dealing with mass graves and the history of repression of the Spanish Civil War in Spain, and without their support and their advice, it won't be possible to have this book produced. Going back to your questions before these necessary clarifications, because it's important to say that this is a product of a collective work of a lot of effort by many people, not only just me. I'm an art historian, but I always like to point out how I'm not a normal art historian. I mean, I'm an art historian who comes from a working class neighborhood in Madrid. And that made me also choose for 2 postgraduate studies in sociology, one first in Serbia and then in Cuba. And that gave me some tools for social analysis, for ethnography, and for sociological approaches to the subjects of study. Then when I decided to go for a PhD research and I started working on the idea of these monuments, for me it was very important to think about how, even though it could be obvious that this is an interesting topic for the memory studies, if we are looking at the art history, it is not. It is not, because even though art history in its own history has been dealing with funerary art over its whole history, from antiquity, Middle Ages, until modern times, contemporary art history is not interested on what people is producing in terms of funerary art. It's mainly interested on what is being shown in museums, galleries, or it's in the market. Therefore, for me, the challenge of producing a sort of art history from below was also always underlying this idea of this work. Of course, I was having always the possibility from the very first moment of participating in forums of memory studies. Also, the conference of memory studies in Madrid in 2019 was a very important forum. It was a time when I was developing my fieldwork by then. And that was somehow giving me, let's say, the framework for deciding to use an interdisciplinary approach to this idea, this concept of how the monuments were being produced in Spain. And at the same time, it was crucial because we were talking about a very particular heritage, a heritage that we don't have documents. These monuments, for those who don't know, Of course, who didn't read the book. We are talking about monuments that were produced by the people in local communities, mainly in villages or small urban towns. Monuments that were produced as a counter-narrative, monuments that were produced in a self-managed way, fundraising the money with like organizing a paella and then getting some money and then hiring a local stonemason to build a monument or bringing flowers and so on and so on. So we are talking about informal practices, practices that we have around the country, are everywhere. Nevertheless, there are very little documents. So how an art historian could approach that? In any case, we'll be just sitting in a desk and reading books or checking Google. I had to visit all those places, to talk to the people, to interview them, to participate in all those practices as an ethnographer, let's say. And thanks to that, to produce enough material to really understand and to write the history behind that. So that was some for what was, it was a necessary condition to produce the research, to produce an interdisciplinary research, because there are many subjects that actually are impossible to approach in a different way. And I think this was one of those.
Have you considered the structure of the book when doing your research, or did you do first the research and then the writing? Because it reads, while reading, I was really there. Also because Alejandro mentioned there's so many photographs. So I had really the feeling of being with you on the research. Could you maybe reveal a little bit of your research writing practice?
Thank you for that question, because I think it's an interesting question, especially for those who maybe are working in their PhDs right now. Because for me, and that's also somehow why the book looks as it looks, I had some ideas, of course, of how I would like to somehow design the book, the thesis and the writing process. Nevertheless, nothing was clear until I developed the whole fieldwork. I mean, I was visiting, I developed my own database of 600 monuments built through mass race. That was quite massive. And then I managed to visit 100 of them, interviewing people, participating in the rituals, unveiling of new monuments, or yearly celebrations. I was collecting a lot of materials, and when I just finally, after all my fieldwork visiting, I did 25,000 kilometers to visit all those places. That's quite a lot, and this is important also to point out that it was also possible to do this because I was fully employed as a Marie Curie fellow by the University of Cologne in Germany, and I was also a member of a research project in Spain that was somehow paying all those expenses. And thanks to that, I was really just merging an amazing amount of material that when I had to synthesize it, it was not so easy. It was not so easy, and it was a process. This was not there were previous drafts, a lot of different scans, and and then I came out with the idea that for making all this information communicable, no? It's just about communicate something you have in your mind, you have in your monuments. It was, first of all, very important to just, in the first part, narrate the story of these people, the people who started just bringing like flowers, slowly building their first gardens, monoliths, monuments, and so on and so on. As the ground for a second part where I was analyzing all the different social problems that are crossing this monument, from the spatiality, the relation with the relatives, the relation with militants and political groups, the relation of this monument with forensic and archaeological researchers, the idea of the human rights, the idea of honor, and so on and so on. And finally, just in the last part, in a third part, to theorize, because it wasn't possible. Indeed, even the own theory I was writing, the third part, was not clearly designed until I finished writing the second part. I mean, I had already that idea of this will happen, but I could not just come with my ideas. And this was also the case during the field work. I was not just arriving to the field with my ideas after having read all the most prominent scholars working on memory and mass race, and then to apply theories on that field. I was just first of all listening to everybody, trying to understand the phenomena, and then after that producing a theoretical interpretation of it.
This is something really important, because it's not just a matter of style, that the theory, Daniel develops the concept of monument practices, meaning gestures in a socio-material context embedded in other gesture. That was a quote, but from the English manuscript. But it's really, there are 3 parts, each consists of 3 chapters, clearly structured, and they lead us toward this theoretical concept. Something which is very familiar to me. I mean, when I learned writing in Poland, this was how my Polish teachers in high school and at the university learned me to write. First present your case studies and your analytical work, and then at the end you come to the result. Something which is very different from the Anglo-Saxon way of writing, where you have at the first, put all your arguments, spoil the narrative in a way, and then you explain how you came to that. I had to learn that in English. I must admit I don't like it, but okay, that's the way you must do that to become visible in the international academia, or not. So that's maybe a good example of doing it in a very individual way. But this is also for the reader, the way Daniel writes is very interesting, because you have to read the whole book. You have to follow the way he thinks to come to his concept at the very end. Not just to read the introduction where everything is explained and then to have some case studies. So it reads like a piece of prose, because you follow the protagonists of the monuments. You followed, I followed Daniel in his narrative, in his travels across Spain. I followed his protagonists who were mourning, who put flowers, who built the monuments, who looked for money, and so on. And at the end, he explained why he was doing that, and where did all this lead him to. So as a reader, I'd like to thank you for this, because it was just a good reading, and one which is very familiar to me, and I hope that it will be also some kind of a narrative intervention into the academia once the book is finally available in English. Alejandro, would you like to add something to that? Because you read the book in Spanish, which is for both of you your native language. So I read it in English, which is not my native language and not Daniel's native language, but you have this native language connection.
I would like to, if I can, because somehow something that was also pushing me to choose this kind of narration and organization of the whole writing of the book was not thinking that much on what the academia expects from me, but what the people I was working with was expecting from me. Because even though this is the result of a PhD project, of an academic research, when I was developing my fieldwork, I was interviewing hundreds of people. People who were, since depending of the story or on the experience, but people who were working and remembering around these mass graves for decades. And their stories were never told. And many of them maybe even get to know some scholars, but the scholars interested on history of the repression, or the memory of the exhumations of the mass graves. But how these people by their own, they somehow produce those monuments, they keep on reproducing the rituals and so on and so on. That was never in the books. And also it was something that was never visibilized by the Spanish media, because we have to think that we have 40 years of fascist dictatorship and then 40 years of transition towards a monarchy that was also never interested on showing the Republican memories of the Spanish War. Therefore, for many people, when I was interviewing them, they were saying that this is a very important monument because this first that was built in the Spain. And I had that comment, I don't know, in maybe 10, because for them, they were really isolated. Nobody was somehow connecting their stories and producing a kind of collective narrative of their experience. So that was a challenge because in a way I had to produce a piece of work and a book that was telling all those stories as a core experience, but at the same time not falling into a generalization. Therefore, building the whole narrative through different stories, as you saw, I have like characters, that each of them is like telling one part of all this way of building a monument around a mass grave was crucial. But also at the same time, when I was choosing for a way of narrating this and writing not just the thesis, but then editing the thing as a book, it was very important for me to give them back a book, because also when I was interviewing many of those campaigners of monuments, they were always saying that we are looking forward that you publish your book because we would like to know what happened at the other side of the country. And therefore, I was from the very beginning knowing that many people who were not going to be academics were going to read the book. Therefore, I thought, if I would go for a very hard academic, analytical writing, it would be a failure for many of those people who, of course, are not familiar with academic language, and it would be quite frustrating. Therefore, I thought it would be necessary to have a different approach. Maybe it's risky for my academic career, but I had that commitment with my field.
We must add that there is also, hard theory in that. So there is Avi Warburg, there is Horst Bredekamp, there is Michel de Certeau, and many, many other theoreticians. So you managed to balance that. But I would be also very interested in Alejandro's opinion on the style and narrative.
On his voice, on the language. Yeah, as I mentioned before, I find it very original. And what I assume, and maybe that's also a rare thing, usually scholars, when they try to cover as much, in Spanish we have an expression, el que mucho abarca, poco aprieta, which means the one who covers too much cannot really grasp. So this would be actually an example of that this saying is not true. So that is something, and I would connect the strong personal voice with his intimate knowledge of the cases and his engagement with the actual people that he interviewed, and I found that quite remarkable. And maybe you can tell us a little bit more about. Usually we say, reflexivity, in particular in social anthropology, but also in sociology, is that all the object of study leaves always traces in the researcher, and those traces should be visible actually in our writing. Can you tell us a bit more about those traces? And how this journey affected you, and how you tried to convey that in your book.
Thank you very much, Alejandro, for those remarks, because for sure that happened. It's a very personal journey, all this research, because as I pointed out, I was just visiting all kind of different places all over Spain. It was a very intense time, and you are interviewing people who is also emotionally very affected and involved in all those processes. And somehow you are too, of course, you are a human being, no? And that was in a way one of those challenges, no? Because in the one hand, I was from the very beginning very aware of the importance of sticking to the idea that I'm studying memory. This is memory studies. I'm not producing memory. They are those who are producing those memories. I have to study this. That's very important because I also think that somehow happens a lot in memory studies that that border is sometimes disappearing and the that place, or when you are really studying memory, when you are researching, analyzing memory, and when you are just producing memory, especially with this kind of context, is that you have stories that have never been told before. I think it's kind of risky. But from the very beginning, I had very clear that distinction, and I thought, even though I will be for sure affected by the whole field, I have to understand what is happening here, no? And to produce a kind of scientific work. Nevertheless, of course, when you go through all those interviews, visiting all those people, because you are not just visiting a Maslow, that is a place that is emotionally heavy. You also go to a village in the middle of nowhere where someone is waiting for you, and then you are visiting this Maslow, interviewing them, but then they invite you to their place for lunch, and then you have a human relation with all of them. Therefore, that was also a challenge when I was writing the book. And writing the whole research, because on the one hand you have to, of course, perceive what is how their discourses are produced. This is a matter of analysis, no? Analyzing what is not only what is true or not. Of course, I'm not entering on that. This is what is affected, how they build their narratives according to one idea or other ideology, no? Nevertheless, at the same time, it was about when I was organizing all those materials, because as you can imagine, I was producing a lot of material that has not been included here. It's not published. It's not, because it was impossible. Just it's impossible. I was trying to choose different aspects from different cases. Nevertheless, it was not possible, of course, to include all of them. And then I was always feeling a bit like betraying someone who I interviewed for not including their stories, but it's not possible. And in the one hand, finally, this is, I mean, we are talking about, I don't know how many pages, but 300 something. That I think is already a lot, but also it's important that it was very important to me to somehow assume that many things had to remain outside, even though I will feel a bit sorry for some of the people with whom I was working, because at the same time it was necessary to produce a book that someone can read, not an encyclopedia. And hopefully maybe in future some other people will go to other places and maybe feel I mean, I already know that some people is already researching. For example, we have a project now just on the Valencian region, and this kind of things may happen in future, but it was necessary to somehow play very carefully with all those materials to organize them, and yeah, it's find the balance between the narration, the scientific, let's say, approach, but also this commitment with the local people who was involved in these practices.
Before I give the floor to the audience for a couple of questions, there is one thing that must be said. I mentioned a couple of times that I read the English manuscript as if it was absolutely obvious that all books exist in at least 2 language versions. And this English manuscript is not a translation. So, Daniel, would you explain how it happened that you have a Spanish book and an English manuscript?
Thank you very much for that question, because I think that's also, I think it's a funny coincidence, you know, I don't know if in coincidence, somehow, because I was developing my PhD studies in Germany at the University of Cologne. The working language was English and German, but for my thesis was English. And English is somehow the academic language, no? It was very clear from the very beginning. I had to do my thesis in English, to publish in English, and so on and so on. Nevertheless, it's a so important topic in Spain that for me it was very clear I had to publish this in Spanish. So at the same time, I was somehow developing like a double manuscript, a manuscript in Spanish and a manuscript in English. It's more or less the same, but it was a lot of work. I mean, it took me months, extra months to have those 2 manuscripts. Nevertheless, for me it was crucial, no? Because most of the people with whom I was working in Spain, all those communities, but also many scholars, won't be able to read this English English thesis, no? And a thesis that somehow, and a book that was somehow working with something that for me was so important, that was public. Therefore, after finishing all my studies and deciding for going ahead and publish the book, I decided first to publish the Spanish manuscript because, again, maybe it was, I thought, maybe it would be worse for my academic career, but I think it's very important that the book first is available really fast in Spanish, because it's an ongoing debate. Nowadays, we still have in Spain like mass graves that are being exhumed, new monuments are being built, and so on and so on. So it was important for me to really, like, as soon as possible, to contribute to the debate with a book that was published in Spanish, available in the language that hundreds of people would read it and use it. And I will think after on my academic career and publish the thing in English, because somehow I think the debates in the academic environment are happening in a different time but luckily you opened this year the book award to other languages, and this happened. No? Even though I thought this would be a failure for my academic career, but I don't mind. It happened. No?
So if we stuck to the initial concept of English book, Daniel would not have been able to submit because the English manuscript is not yet a book. So I think it's also a perfect contribution to our multilingual idea of memory studies. And this is where I would like to stop. And if you have questions, mainly Daniel, that's the right time to ask them.
Hi, hello. Thank you for this wonderful discussion. It was really moving to listen to all the conversation. The question I had was about a phrase that was mentioned, and it's just out of curiosity, that the book also uses literary license. I think Alejandro said that at certain points it's like a literary license. So I was curious, like, in what way?
Thank you very much for your question. Yes, that was also kind of risk. My PhD advisor told me, I don't know if this is very adequate, but I think I was doing systematically all like things that I was thinking that were going to be like a negative for the academic career, but positive for the reception. And I hope somehow this is contributing to reconsidering some aspects. I think Alejandro was referring to this because of the introduction. Because the introduction, on the contrary of an introduction of academic book, I will say, whereas also as we were talking about that you have like a theoretical framework, methodological the description of very clear and systematically how the methodology is going to face the research and so on and so on. I'm starting writing a kind of almost a novel. No? It's like a fiction. No? I create a fictional narration about some shippers and the picture of Arcadia by Nicolas Poussin, and how it's a picture of Poussin when you have some shippers standing next to a stone that says in Arcadia ego, that is about how even death is present in Arcadia, and then I'm creating a whole narration on how the shippers are relating with the monument, and how Arcadia could be understood as Spain, because Arcadia is like a kind of utopian country, but then death is present there, and I relate with this idea of Spain as a touristical place, and how this idea of a place where violence is not present according to the public image of the country, but then you have those stones that are somehow breaking the reality and their narration. So it was kind of fiction. It's a fiction, and somehow I think the first 20 pages I'm just writing a story that won't be probably accepted by many peer review processes. But for me, it was a challenge also of thinking on the reader, that the reader was taking this book and not starting with a heavy description of theory or history, but trying to bring them to kind of to the game, no, to the idea of starting to think this from a different perspective, no.
Hello, thank you so much for your presentation. I wish to question the idea you mentioned, the balance between to find a personal voice when you are telling your research, and also the risk of some kind of ego, maybe storytelling. Could you say to us a little bit more about that, and maybe some advices for PhD students? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question, because I think it's also a challenge when you try to introduce your own voice. But for me, it was in a way part of this commitment with the idea of a social art history or an art history from below with ethnographical techniques, because that's something that has not been developed that much in art history over the last few decades. Therefore, maybe I think this is a debate that is more present in anthropology and other social science disciplines, nevertheless not in art history. I mean, actually, as I was also working with some anthropologists, I was aware of this perspective of readings and so on and so on. And I choose for that because somehow was showing the necessity, even for an art historian, to go to those places, not to just develop a research like a desk research or in a library. The necessity of going to those places and interviewing and talking to people and so on, because I was somehow documenting all those places by myself. And also it was important in terms of being humble and saying I'm honest with what I'm working with, because this is my perspective. There was, at least that I know, 600 of these monuments. I managed to visit 100 of them, to talk to all these people. And this is also a consequence of fieldwork that is an ongoing process. If I will be a different person, I will have maybe talked to other community members, other campaigners of monuments, and maybe the narration could look different. So for me, it was always very important to show this was my research, not because my ego, because I don't know, I didn't have that ego. I mean, for me, it was the idea of showing certain also issues that happened to me when I was developing the research. I was going to places that are not so well known. You are going to local villages. No, it's kind of effort that for me it was important to show in the narration. That is obvious that we are not talking about an easy heritage. We are talking about a very particular heritage that are monuments built through mass graves that are in the ostracism of society, in very awkward places. And we are talking also with people. We are reading the stories of people who also has suffered like being neglected by the official history for decades, and it was kind of commitment. I don't know if Alejandro maybe has a perception because he read the book, and maybe I can be like partial.
Thank you. We actually, okay, last quick question, because we need to end sharp because Alejandro has his return flight.
Okay, so first of all, Daniel, felicitaciones. My question has to do with, obviously I haven't read your work yet, but do you include any ephemeral types of commemoration that could be perceived as making monuments for those that, you know, are fallen? So like songs produced by family members or by the community that, you know, made it to the pages on your book. Thanks.
Much for your question. Yes, I think one of the key points was that